just going to up that to accommodate additional information and safety measures based on our current situation. Training would also be provided on new procedures in the school building. And that includes identifying which spaces are not available in the fall, whether that would be the library or a computer lab, etc. Training would also be provided on the needed tech tools or digital resources used in the classroom. And I say including passwords because that came through loud and clear from about 50% of the parents responding to the survey saying that they struggled remembering their kids' passwords. So that is something that absolutely we would work towards making that a simpler process. And then, of course, as guidance around COVID-19 changes over the course of the year, students will be provided with updated training if procedures were to shift. Okay, now we get to arrival. Students use hand sanitizer at the sanitizer station prior to entering the classroom. Students follow the procedures and walk straight to their assigned desks. So every student is assigned his or her own student desk, not to be shared with another student. That desk is physically distanced per the CDC guidelines of 6 feet. So that's really important to understand that Assistant Superintendent Thompson and I went to the school buildings and physically moved and measured all the desks. We identified that our classrooms here in our elementary schools can have 20 student desks with 6 feet of separation. That sometimes requires the removal of other furniture, but it is possible. Now, many of our specs are already at or below 20. So if we take roughly 72% of that, we're now well within plenty of space within our existing classrooms. Students each have their own set of materials, including a charged Chromebook or similar device. Elementary students remain in their homeroom and specialists travel to them rather than all the different sections traveling to the music room, let's say. Food service will continue to offer bagged breakfast and lunch to those interested. However, students can continue to select the option of bringing their own lunch. During the day, if a student or staff member is displaying a symptom of COVID, they will be masked, brought to the secondary nurse's office, which we have identified in all of our buildings. We call it an isolation station, but that doesn't sound as friendly as the secondary nurse's office, and sent home. Students will be required to have a doctor's clearance or cleared by the school nurse to return to school. Guidance that was just released today states that symptomatic and confirmed with COVID-19, at least 10 days have passed since symptoms first appeared, and at least 24 hours have passed since the last fever, and symptoms have improved. In addition to more specifics that were just released today, but of course we are going to follow all the state level guidance. Staff members will be required to follow the already established procedure in human resources if they are experiencing symptoms. In the case of a positive COVID test, notification will take place per our state requirements, and contact tracing will begin. Our response as a district varies based on the tracing. So a response to, let's say, a preschooler in a class of 8 students, where a parent dropped off the student went straight to the room, and that classroom was exposed, that response is different from potentially our high school student who took the bus, traveled to 7 different classrooms with 7 different groupings of students, et cetera. So every situation is taken into consideration. And if you recall, back in March, we did have a suspected case, and we did the same thing. We analyzed the situation, we analyzed possible exposure, and we made a decision out of an abundance of caution that we felt was most appropriate given the tracing that we completed. The same would be true for the school year. All right, during the day and dismissal. So students will be washing their hands with soap and water for 20 seconds periodically. When soap and water are not available, they will use hand sanitizer at the classroom station or their own if they have it. We will also stagger a dismissal to alleviate traffic caused by additional personal vehicles. We fully understand that by asking parents to possibly bring their children to school rather than utilize our bus, that we're going to have an additional traffic issue, especially at HPS where there's already a good number of cars on 122. So we had a lengthy discussion with transportation and included Officer Bergeron in that conversation about how do we adjust carpool, and we will be staggering dismissals, releasing a few minutes earlier to get the parent loop out of the way for the buses. Students will also bring their device home each afternoon to charge it and complete homework as necessary. So that was the option for in-person, but we also have remote learning 2.0. So direct instruction will follow the in-person instruction model in regard to both the schedule and the expectations for learning. Daily live Zoom sessions will be required for instruction. Session length and daily frequency are based on district-determined best practice. So what a 15-year-old is expected to participate in varies greatly from what a 5-year-old is expected to participate in terms of screen time. Specific expectations for learning will be shared at the onset by the teacher, including the mandatory specials in the elementary. In the spring, as we were learning, some of the specialists became optional if and when you could participate. But we're saying that is part of our mandated educational curriculum, and so they will be required in remote learning. The pacing of remote learning will mirror in-person instructional models. Assessment expectations will be shared at the onset. We want to make sure that we are assessing our students' progress and not a sibling or someone else's progress. For elementary specifics, we will offer a required morning meeting. We will have a daily math and ELA mini lesson. We will have social studies and science every other day. After those mini lessons, there will be classwork to participate in. Students will participate in small group instruction, potentially via a separate Zoom invite, or potentially in a breakout room within the Zoom. After the whole class instruction, like I said, there will be practice, remediation, and small group instruction. And the feedback on a student's performance and areas for improvement or areas that they're excelling will be provided and identified in a format ahead of time so that you as the parent would know where to find that feedback, and each of the students would also know where to find that feedback rather than searching in a variety of locations. I'll quickly just mention, for secondary, we're going to have rock and cav block as part of remote learning. Students log into Zoom sessions following their daily schedule, so for each period of the day, they will log into each class that would meet if they were in the in-person model. The practice would follow the mini lesson model and then log off the Zoom and then engage in classwork. Homework will be assigned, and it will be assigned for all students, whether in person or in remote, over Google Classroom, so the same experience is being shared by all students. Once again, feedback would be provided in an identified format.
And so again, there were two documents that were created. One was created with the various working groups. That document is approximately 45 pages. And the second document was a summary report, which was included in the board packet that many of you may have seen. And so what I'd like to do is we're going to walk you through that summary report to highlight some of the areas that I know are of interest to members of the community. Again, some of this information is slightly redundant, as Assistant Superintendent Bergskog just mentioned. So let's start with the area of health and safety. The Health and Safety Committee met, and these are the draft proposals that we're looking to put in place. There'll be daily health screenings of students that parents are expected to do. They would have a symptoms checklist that they would have to complete every day. This would also include taking the temperature of their child. It's important to note with this specific recommendation that we have actually had a small number of students in special education who have been receiving on-site services, and many of the health and safety protocols that we're recommending have actually been in place since March as these students have attended on-site, and they've been very effective. Additionally, there would be targeted temperature checks within the building conducted by the school nurse. The committee did look at the option of universal temperature checks, but due to the asymptomatic nature of COVID-19, the decision was to do targeted checks. So anytime a student would be sent to the nurse's office or travel through the nurse's office, they'd have their temperature checked. Additionally, if a student was returning from an absence for any reason, they would have their temperature checked as part of a clearance process through the nurse's office. Masks will be required when social distancing is not possible. This means all the time on the school bus, all the time in the hallway. This means if you have a classroom where desks are not spaced 6 feet apart, then masks will be required. We will also institute staggered dismissal times. This is going to look different in each building based upon the master schedule. This could mean that carpool students are dismissed a few minutes before bus students or remain later. It could mean staggered dismissal of buses. We also will be reducing student movement, as Assistant Superintendent Bergskog mentions, by having teachers do more of the traveling and having students stay put. We'll also have hand sanitizer and wipes available in all classrooms and common areas. And next, Assistant Superintendent Bergskog will talk about instructional.
I forgot it was my turn. So this committee met, and there was certainly a lot to cover. We did, the recommendation is to continue the extensive review of previous school year curriculum. The assumption was that there was the good chance that not the entire year last year was covered, given our quick jump to remote learning. So in the professional development days that followed the school year, teachers began that process of identifying specifically what was not covered and then shared that through their PLCs with the next grade level. That work will continue if it was not completed already. The other recommendation is collaboration time will be built in for teachers to discuss student progress, both remote and in person. There will be a development of enhanced remediation for struggling students. There will also be instruction in personal and public health measures for the students. Where appropriate, we're strongly encouraging teachers to move the instruction outdoors, take advantage of the nice weather when possible. There's also the recommendation to increase the number of recesses per day for the on-site model so that students are able to begin to reacclimate to working with their peers. The utilizing of shared instructional materials will no longer take place, so all students will have their own instructional materials in their space. And as I mentioned already, elementary specialists would come to the classroom, to the homeroom, to engage in their instruction. Moving on to technology, there were a lot of technical details that we needed to figure out, but at the same time, technology is so woven into instruction that we separated them, but they're sort of hand in hand now that we have a proposal. All students would have access to their own device, and there would be no more sharing of devices, no stacks of Chromebooks in the classroom. There's no checking out of devices in the library. Every student would have his or her own device with them in the classroom, and they would take them home at the end of the day. Students would be assigned a school laptop or Chromebook when one is not available at home, just as we did in the spring. And the expectation is that devices come to school charged every day. Moving on to human resources. We have a very robust volunteering program, and we're going to have to put some very strict restrictions on that to decrease the number of people in the school buildings. There will be staff professional development and evidence-based public health practices. There will be staff professional development in the use of digital tools. And I'm going to add to that the use of digital tools, in surveying the teachers, we identified the tools that were most beneficial, utilized most often, and the ones that teachers felt were critically important to advance instruction. So those are the ones that we're going to continue to use. We're going to provide videos and how-to documents for the teachers, as well as for families if those students are in remote, or for the students who are in remote, because I'm a parent of 4, and knowing how to help my children navigate these digital tools, that was certainly a learning curve for everybody, and that's an important piece of continuing to work together through this. Custodial responsibilities would be adjusted to include increased deep cleaning, and I would say that their custodial shifts would also be shifted to different times of the day to make sure that we have increased deep cleaning. Already, as part of the budget that was approved, we have an additional sub-nurse shared amongst our 6 buildings, so that already provides additional support to the building that may need it at the time. We will continue our restriction on out-of-state professional development for teachers. So most professional development these days has been online, but we did have to restrict some folks way back when the virus sort of just came to fruition in our area. We're going to continue that restriction.
Looking at facilities, we, in all 6 school buildings in SAU 41, we've expanded the nurse's office to include an additional site. One would be for routine traffic. That's students coming down for medication, bumps and bruises, students with anxiety, students that just want to check in with a nurse. And then a second auxiliary location where any students that was identified as being symptomatic would be sent. We were very strategic in the location of this second auxiliary site, so that if need be, we can get students out safely and quickly as well. We're also restricting access to certain common areas. Again, this really is dependent upon each one of the buildings, but an example of that would be computer labs. We do not want students sharing computer equipment, and since they'll all be issued their own device, the need for computer labs is just not there. This will provide us with additional space should we need it, either for the nurses' auxiliary space or for additional classroom instructional space to reduce classroom size. We're also restricting access to lockers. We are in the process of removing excess furniture from classrooms. Again, Assistant Superintendent Bergskog and myself traveled to the various schools and looked at what does 6 feet of social distancing look like in a classroom. It's tight, it really is. And in order to achieve that, we need to take furniture out of classrooms. So the SAU is in the process of contracting with storage providers so that we can take excess furniture and we can store it in the parking lot in a storage unit or off-site. Again, increased airflow by opening up windows and interior doors when that's appropriate, when the weather permits for that. And then also we have hired an independent consultant who is going to look into all of our, will review all of our HVAC systems to make sure that they are up to standard given the transmission of the virus. In student services, again, any student that is unable to attend physical school will have access to a remote environment. That's irregardless of whether they have a disability or not. One of the things that the Student Services Group really spent a lot of time looking at was socialization. They want students to have greater opportunities to socialize. At an elementary school level, that might mean an additional morning meeting, additional recess. At the middle school, that might look like added advisory time or an extended lunchtime outside. At the high school, that could look like expanding CAV block. We also discussed in the Student Services Working Group the need for further development of our social emotional programming. As many of you may be aware, last year the district implemented the Choose Love program, which was created by Charlotte Lewis. Her son Jesse Lewis was murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and she's created a very robust social emotional learning program that our teachers were very excited to implement, and we ended up moving to a remote learning environment. We will continue the work of developing our social emotional programs, including the Choose Love program. All of our IEP 504 and student progress meetings will continue to be held remotely until further notice. And staff will be receiving training in the research-based program, Mental Health First Aid. For those of you who are familiar with mental health first aid, it works along the same premise as first aid or CPR does. If you were to identify a person struggling with mental health issues, you would provide them short-term care while you are able to identify somebody who might be able to come in and provide longer-term care. Many of our teachers have already been trained in this program, and ideally what we would like to do is train every one of our staff members in mental health first aid by the conclusion of the school year. Looking at food service, there will be significant modifications to the food service program. We'll be moving to a grab-and-go breakfast lunch option. You know, students would receive their lunch in a bag. And also, we would provide food service access to our students who remained in remote learning. Again, this school district feeds a large number of students. This is where students get, a number of students get the bulk of their meals between breakfast, lunch, and even the support provided by the nonprofit organization known as End 68 Hours of Hunger. So we need to continue that work. We'll also move to a cashless purchase model in the cafeteria. So students would use their lunch ID number to purchase a lunch. And just as is our current practice, if a student did not have money, no student will be refused a lunch. They'll still have access to food. For the time being, we will not accept any food donations for classroom parties or celebrations. That will be put on hold until further notice. And also, we'll be suspending concessions at sporting events.
For extracurricular, most of the guidelines are driven by the NHIAA. All students will have a temperature check prior to participating in an extracurricular activity. There's no mask requirement for students who are engaged in strenuous physical activity. Students are required to bring their own water. There will be a limit to the public attendance at games. For student pickup, parents would remain in their vehicle and students would be brought to the parent vehicle. Opposing teams would not have access to the locker rooms. They would come fully dressed, just as we do in town league baseball and soccer. Our facility use would be limited to outside groups, just to prevent unnecessary people in and out of our buildings. And school-sponsored overnight travel would be suspended until further notice. That's a co-op issue, but just so we all are on the same page. And for transportation, you want to take that?
Sure. So in terms of transportation, we're going to strongly encourage parents to provide transportation outside of the school bus. There really is no way, with the numbers of students that we have riding the buses, to properly social distance. That's part of the requirement for wearing masks. So face mask will be required when a student gets on the bus. We'll also ask students to use hand sanitizer before getting on the bus. Students will have assigned seating. This will also allow for siblings to be able to sit together on the bus. But if there were to be a potential outbreak, we would easily be able to identify where students were sitting on the bus. When possible, again, we'll keep the windows open as much as we can. That's easy to do in the fall. It's a lot harder to do in the wintertime. And then the buses will undergo routine daily sanitizing. Of note here is there are federal regulations that limit some safety protocols of being put in place on a bus. One example is plexiglass. It's challenging to put plexiglass on a bus. So that's really why the recommendation would be, if a parent has the means to drive their child to school, we'd ask that you please do that. So in addition to what the roadmap, which is the 7-page document that's in the board packet, there's a much lengthier document. Again, it's approximately 45 pages. This really was the working document of the various working groups. And again, it had in it the various considerations, lots of questions that arose from the many reports that we looked at. And when looking at each one of those considerations, we looked at it through the 3 possible models, one being a remote model, the second being a hybrid model, and the third being a full return model. And it's important to note that they contain, the 43-page document contains building level guidelines that accommodate the individual needs of each student, of each school. So that document allows for each school to reflect on what the need is for that building, and each building has developed their own reopening committee, and they can take that 43-page document and apply the standards as they see necessary. Obviously, those plans will be vetted through the SAU to ensure that there's some level of consistency and that all health and safety measures are taken into account. It also identifies various processes and procedures that you don't see outlined in the document in the board packet. And then it also provides minimum standards and directives for remote learning. And again, the plan is designed to be nimble. It allows for quick transition for each of the three models based on current conditions. So going back to what we said earlier, right now, with the local conditions being what they are, we believe that we can offer an on-site physical learning environment. That could change in a few weeks. And if it does change in a few weeks, because we see an uptick in numbers, we may go to a hybrid model, which could be a few days a week, like some surrounding communities, or it's a fully remote model. We need to be able to pivot between the three models very, very quickly. And I would argue that if on March 13th we were able to put our entire school district into remote learning in a very short number of days, I believe that the weeks that we have between now and the start of school and all of the thoughtful planning that has gone into the three models will allow for us to quickly move in and out of each of the three models.
So this is just an example of what that very large, cumbersome document looks like. This is under the instructional committee. One of the considerations was how many students can we safely fit in a standard 900 square foot classroom if social distancing requirements remain in place. So we identified that 20 students can fit in most classrooms. There are some exceptions with kindergarten, which isn't an issue anyway because the ed specs are lower than that. But that would require the removal of certain pieces of furniture and carpets. Our high school science labs would be able to fit 24 students. Small group instruction would have to take place either in an alternate room with masks, face shields, or plexiglass, depending on the specific circumstance for that small group instruction. A discussion item that we came up with was viewing the board. Not every seat has the best view of the board. And would students be able to work in small groups if wearing face masks? And as we identified above, small group instruction could best take place in alternate settings. There are many details here. How do we minimize the transmission of the virus through surface contact? So in our first column, this was if we're fully remote, model 1. Every student has their own device or Chromebook, and sharing supplies is a non-issue because you're in your home. In the middle, we had the hybrid model 2, which really is a combination of model 1 and model 3. In model 3, we still are identifying that every student has a Chromebook. There are no shared supplies. Teachers are being asked to judiciously review the back-to-school items request, knowing that every student would need their own set of supplies. So we want to make sure that the supplies that we're asking parents to purchase are very intentional. They'll be used fully, and they contain everything that the student would need to be successful in school that year. And they would also have to coordinate with specialists because we would also need to take a look at materials that they would need for art class in the classroom because we won't be sharing spaces. Students will still be able to collaborate while they're working through Google Classroom, Google Docs, etc. The recommendation of the committee. So keep in mind this long document was a series of recommendations to the superintendent. So this committee recommended closing shared spaces such as computer labs or libraries. Buildings would determine best practice for classroom libraries. So that would be the book bin that your child would have for the reading material that would be the just right books for them. So what is the exact procedure for, rather than just freely taking books back and forth, you have your books for a set period of time, and when you're done, they're put aside, sanitized, rather than going back to the library as they have been in prior years. Backpacks are are to be used, but we are not to use lockers. So we go through every committee, and we have this pretty detailed list of recommendations. So we looked at, is Zoom the best option? You know, so many options were made available to us in March, and you know, some teachers tried a variety of options. Zoom came out to be the recommendation for video meeting space, and we have a recommendation of the big blue button as a secondary recommendation. A number of teachers also relied heavily on Screencast-O-Matic or Screencast-ify, so that's another recommendation of this committee, and professional development would be provided on all of these platforms for all of our teachers. And as we mentioned, a lot of this is procedures. What is the process for staff members who are unable to work or return to work, and reasons including COVID, related to COVID or non-COVID? So these would go through a confidential process with HR, as they always do, but that process would be continued, and all of our appropriate laws would be applied to every specific circumstance. What happens if a student contracts the virus? So as we just have a new guidance that was released today, this document has not been adjusted to reflect that, so I'm going to keep going. Food service. Do we ban shared foods? Yes, we do. Are we serving lunch in the classroom? So the recommendation is a classroom model for serving lunch combined with electronic lunch count ahead of time. So at the beginning of the day, the lunch is selected and sent to food service, and then those specific lunches are delivered. The variety will be limited. The variety would all be paper bag lunches. Can we expand the nurse's office to allow for greater isolation? As we mentioned earlier, yes, we're looking at every building has a secondary nurse's space for isolation, so that there's a separation between students on a routine visit and students or staff members who are experiencing symptoms. And then student service consideration was, how do we progress monitor students to determine what possible compensatory obligations the district will have? We already began looking at students and their progress prior to ESY. We will repeat that same process at the return to school, whether that's in person or remote. We are looking at progress and monitoring at all of our September meetings. We are required to have additional meetings in September for our students. Regular ed data will also be really important, because the thought is that there was potential regression amongst all students, not just identified students. So how do we really know what the possible regression is if we're looking at across the board possible regression? So therefore, we're creating an expanded, focused RTI time, separate from class time, to offer that remediation and Tier 2 support to all of our students who might need it. Once again, we had very specifics with extracurricular activities, practices, meetings, rehearsals. So coaches, advisors, and participants should not arrive more than 15 minutes prior to the designated start time. They cannot enter the designated facility until that start time. Congregating would not be allowed. Upon pickup, drivers should arrive at the scheduled time, remain in the vehicle. This student would be returning to the car directly. And so we worked together as a community over the past few months to develop this what I call a robust plan. We are one community. We're in this together. We couldn't have been so successful in the spring without the collaboration with families in remote learning. And I could not have guessed where families would be in terms of their comfort level without participating in a survey. So I thank everyone. I share this photo. For those of you who may not know, we were able to hold an outdoor graduation, maintaining physical distancing amongst all graduates, with only their parents present. So if we can pull a graduation off, I feel we can do anything if we're in this together. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. All right, as per our amended agenda, We are going to move public input now. So I'll just make a couple comments regarding public input. The board conducts all its business through meetings held in public. All those present from the community are invited to stay and listen to the board's discussions and deliberations and actions. Public input is permitted during the public input portion of our agenda and when the chair opens the floor for public comment. At that time, public input is most welcome and encouraged. The intention of public input is for the board to gather and consider the sense of the public in making its decisions related to our posted agenda items. As per policy BA, when the chair opens the floor for the public input, please state your name and address for the record. Address your agenda-related remarks to the chair only. Whenever possible, be specific as to the actions you wish the board to take and why. Generally, questions from the public will be noted, but not necessarily directly addressed at the time somebody asked the question. Statements are generally limited to 3 minutes. The chair will recognize point of order challenges from the board or community member at any time during the meeting for not adhering to the posted adjusted agenda or regular order processes and procedures for conducting a public meeting. Thank you. With that stated, I will go ahead and open the floor for public input.
Joe Garuba, 28 Winchester Drive. I'd like to ask a couple of procedural questions. May I remove my mask as I'm speaking here, as Mr. Thompson has done? It's a lot easier.
Yeah, you may.
Thank you. I feel better already. So the agenda specifically for tonight had an item on it about a non-discrimination policy. And Carol, I'm grateful to her motion in the beginning of the meeting, where she had the board make a presentation or go through their presentation before the public comment period, because a ton of my questions were answered, and that was very helpful in focusing the remarks that I'm going to make. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to ask right now is that if there is any discussion that or a presentation that the board has on the non-discrimination item, that the board make that presentation, and then I'll come back and make my comments, or I can make my comments and reserve my comments for the non-discrimination policy later. It's up to you.
So what I would say to that is that the resolution on that subject was presented at the governing board, and the reason for that is it's really one of the few times all 3 districts come together. So a decision was made to present that initially at that body so they could socialize that resolution. I can tell you the district has not taken that up yet, and so this would be the first evening or the first opportunity that we would take that up. At this point, this is a very challenging, content-packed agenda. We're going to try to get to it if we can before running out of time. So we're still going to, it's on the agenda, and we're going to try to get to it, but most of our attention and focus right now is on the plan.
So if you can't, if you don't want to have the discussion beforehand, then I guess I'll just make my comments to include that now. Is that correct?
Rob, since I was the one that made the public...
I'm looking for input.
Yeah, sure. Since I was the one who moved public input to after here, it was expecting that the majority of the input tonight was going to be on this. I happen to know Mr. Garuba wanted to talk on the resolution. Would it be inappropriate or out of line to suggest that we also open public input specifically on that after that is
Post
broached?
Our discussion?
Post presentation of the resolution as well, since we've already moved one, and the idea was to allow the presentations to happen first, just for fairness.
Looking for more input from the rest of the membership?
procedurally, is that okay for us to make that change right now?
We have the ability to add additional public input as part of our policy. We have that latitude, yes.
So I would like to add public input after the resolution is presented this evening
Okay.
to have everything kind of stay on target tonight.
Okay, any objections?
I do.
I don't have an objection, but I'd like to comment that I consider the initiative imperative to school reopening and important to address today.
Sure, okay.
I'm sorry, am I on? I can't tell. So I'm very concerned that we are not going to have time to give that resolution the attention it deserves. I'd be the first to stand up for its intent and its sentiment. I have some concerns about some of the language in it, and I think it deserves, half a meeting all by itself. I'm very worried we're going to run out of time. Look at all the public that's here to comment on, I'm assuming most people have commentary to make on the opening of school. To the specific point, I'm not aware that we have a presentation per se, aside from the inclusion of the initiative material in the packet. Is that correct?
So, yes, that's correct.
So to Joe's point, or his question, there isn't a presentation, it's a discussion item.
So what I'm thinking of is,
My understanding of
Yeah.
what was stated at the governing board meeting in the minutes was that our superintendent would be presenting the resolution at this meeting.
okay, so
That was the language that was used.
why don't we try to get to that? We'll have the superintendent go through the resolution. And then once that's presented, it's a rather short one-pager. And after that, why don't we get a public input session for that?
Yeah, and really the whereas doesn't necessarily need to be spoken to through the entire thing. The actual resolution is very brief.
Well, it is, but I would argue that I want that resolution read in its entirety. What's on the
Agreed.
page is what gets read, because we also want to get it into our meeting
Good.
records.
Very
So
good, I agree.
we're good?
Agree.
We're good? Okay, that's what we'll do.
So adding public input
We will add a
after.
public input session after the reading of the resolution, and we'll provide time for that.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Sure.
Appreciate the flexibility.
you.
So, in general, I was super happy to hear that the board took the results of that survey in mind and acknowledged the fact that you're going to present choice and really acknowledge how important it is to have our students in school for 5 days a week for 6 hours a day, because that kind of structure at the elementary school level is absolutely critical. And I know we all struggled through what went on in remote learning, and I'm very grateful to the board because I know you guys had to put this together with no time at all. So it was a lot of effort, but it was a stopgap effort, and I think that it was leaving our children short education-wise. So I'm very grateful that you're opening the schools and you're going to keep them open 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. That's all I had to say.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Agatha Conley, and 14 Sawmill Road. And I just want to say thank you to the board, the SAU, the administration for your leadership during this time, to the teachers and staff as well on the reopening plan. The SAU focus on education, health, well-being, and cleanliness of our students will provide an effective path to the academic success in their future. So thank you again for demonstrating the leadership and concern and compassion for their future.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Jesse, 57 Buttonwood. I want to second that. Thank you very much. This is a robust plan. I think it's critically important for our kids to get back to school, and I just really want to thank the work that you guys for the work you've put into this. I do have some questions. So this is a great plan. As you said, we are thankfully in a set of conditions that right now are pretty safe. I'd like to understand a little bit more with respect to how you're going to manage this on a day-to-day basis. Execution is going to matter here. Training of staff, compliance, how will we know that these measures are being effectively implemented? And then how are we going to monitor the local conditions? And under what thresholds will we kind of trigger changes to the plan? I'd just like to have some visibility into that. Obviously, as things could change quickly here, and I want to, kind of have a sense as to how we're going to be executing against that.
Yeah. So, Andy, I suspect a lot of those trigger points for pivoting to a different model is not going to be made necessarily atomically by us. We're going to have a lot of conversations probably with the state level and other maybe CDC guidelines, but I'll let you summarize.
To take your last question first. Right now, today, I can't tell you exactly what the monitoring will be, but before we open, we'll be able to put that in writing and send it out to families, because we're still working with the CDC, Health and Human Services. One of the pieces that we learned in March was it is our local decision. And ultimately, on a Friday afternoon, I made it, and I'll live with that because it came safety first. That's kind of the first place I will go again, because every day, the parents in this community let me be the parent for 6 hours. And I'm going to make the decision like I would as a dad. So I'm going to be very cautious, and I'm going to follow the data. Locally, for enforcement, we're going to work with our administrative team, and we meet regularly to follow the data. We have outstanding school nurses. They have come along for the ride and guided me in many areas that I'm not an expert on. And those nurses are not afraid to let me know when they're concerned. And I trust them just like I would my own children's school nurse. I'm also very fortunate we have a group in this community who stepped forward and is working with me, who are pediatricians, mental health specialists, a variety of different expertise. And they know they're on this for the year. It wasn't a couple meetings and they're done. So just like we learned today from the Health and Human Services of how we would react to a positive case, what are the steps? I ran into one of our nurses as I was touring the primary school today who was on the same call. Bob was in the SAU office doing it. Ellen was at the primary school, and we learned that the temperature is going to be 100 degrees. That's kind of low. We're going to have a lot of kids coming in and out, especially as we get closer to the season. The other thing I'm going to do, which we're not announcing tonight, but I'm not opposed to sharing it, is I'm going to work with the boards to build in some benchmarks. So we're going to have some set dates, and those dates would allow people maybe to transition back to school if things are getting better, or transition to remote if they're getting worse. I'll also look at dates like we traditionally have school the Monday and Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. We may decide to do those remote, because then I'll have a whole week to do a deep cleaning, and I might do the same around Christmas time and just keep following the disease and kind of watching that data. But I can also say that every time I've called the state of New Hampshire, they have returned my call. Now, they do tell me it's my decision, but they always are willing to provide me their input and how they might make the call.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Raul Blanchet, 1 Mendelssohn Drive. I just want to echo the comments that were made earlier in support of your plan. I think it's excellent. If based on my personal experience at work, I might tweak it a little bit here or there. For example, at work, we're providing free food to everyone so that to minimize and eliminate the contact. And there is a limited menu, but still it's very plentiful. My question really deals with the exit strategy. Every roadmap is like a tunnel. You go in, but you're not quite sure how long it's going to be, but you expect an exit. Can you tell us a little bit more about metrics you might be looking at? I don't want generalities, I want to be more specifics. What are you looking for to begin the transition in one direction or another? But at the end of the day, we need to have a sense of how you're measuring, or at least making those determinations as to when you exit from this situation. And there may be some criteria that you will use And I think that transparency needs to be fed back to the community. In other words, not just relying on Facebook or Twitter, but at least have a consistent mechanism where some of us older folks who may not be constantly practicing social media, that we can then monitor or track. For example, from the very beginning, I've been tracking the Johns Hopkins University website that looks at data across the world. And you can do some very interesting statistics and comparisons based on that. So you might want to think about creating a similar type of site with some statistics. I know it's a lot more burden, but I think might be a good challenge to your mathematical whiz kids and your teachers to maybe work on something like that.
No,
So I appreciate what you're doing, and I look forward to at least getting a sense for how well we're doing as we transition the tunnel, and when to expect an exit, from the tunnel.
So with that, what I'm thinking of it, that's almost like a second phase to this, right? Because this document really talks about how we're going to reopen under COVID conditions, if you will. I would expect that that would be a second step of a body of work to be able to document that and communicate what that exit strategy would be. What metrics would we use to move towards a more regular model? I don't know, what's your thoughts?
I think it's a point well taken. The metric still needs to be created, and I can tell you that I meet weekly with the superintendents from the southern tier of New Hampshire, and many of us have the same questions, and that's not necessarily an area where we're getting guidance on. So together we'll work together and come to some solution. But I agree with you, it needs to be concrete. It needs to be able to be put out there, and people need to, in very simple terms, understand what it means. Now, one of the pieces that we're trying to do, because not everybody's on social media, I am not, so I don't get any of my information there. But what we're working with is the Rotary has established a new communication, and their communication tends to go to a different population. So we're going to be working with them, and all the information that comes out of the SAU, as soon as it goes on social media, will go to the Rotary's newspaper, and hopefully we start to hit all the demographics in the community and not just the school-age children.
One last suggestion, one of those committees could be working on the exit strategy.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Good
Absolutely.
point.
On that note, if I can just chime in, Andy, couldn't we also do a better job of putting all of the information on SAU 41? I know that website's getting a refresh, so if we can make sure that a page like that is added, that I think is going to be the best place, accessible to all.
Yeah, I think once we get the new website up and running, then we as an SAU have to decide, I'll say, where are the 3 locations people are going to find information.
Right.
And just keep hammering home the 3 places you look. You know,
Yep.
social media will be one, the SAU will be another, but I think there is a population don't have children in school anymore, and they want to know what's going on because it does impact them. And quite frankly, they're very, very supportive of our schools, so I want them to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy.
Hi, my name is Isabel Ramos, and I live on 9 Colburn Lane, Hollis, New Hampshire. And I would like to talk about why I would like to go to school, and also what my concerns are about going back. So first of all, I would like to go to school because, you know, my friends, and I would like to see people again. Well, people my age, actually. And I kind of want to be at a desk and not just sitting at a screen all day. And actually going outside to play instead of just sitting in my dad's office and just looking at a screen until I'm actually done with most of my work. But my concerns are that, like, you know how teachers are gonna be saying stay 6 feet apart and like cover your cough, and maybe you might need to wear a mask during school. But most of the kids are probably not gonna stay 6 feet apart and are probably gonna be coughing all over everybody. And well, at least most people. and sometimes I might get a little bit nervous if there are more than 100 people at least at the max. So I think I would like to go to school if there was a maximum of people in my grade or maybe in the entire school. So that's why that's most of my concerns and why I would like to go back to school. Thank you.
What's your name again?
Isabel Ramos.
Isabella. Isabella. Well, Isabella, I think you are incredibly brave. First of all, little girl, it's not easy coming up to that mic and talking to a bunch of people maybe you don't know. And I would just like to say that you are our #1 stakeholder. That's why we're up here. That's why we meet each month. And that's why we put all this work in just for you and all the other students. So thank you for giving us that input. It means a lot.
Thank you.
Harold Cadman, 169 Depot Road. I'm probably not going to be as brave as Isabel. You might hear my voice quiver. I wanted to bring up a couple of studies that were done in Sweden, one in Germany, 2,000 students screened, and it was determined that children are not spreading the virus. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, one doctor claims that the children actually provide a block to the virus. So, and this is really has to do with the magnitude of the effort that's going to be on all of you and all the teachers to pull this plan, which is really comprehensive, and I can appreciate how much work went into that. But to do the I'm not even going to comment about the social distancing, but the mask wearing and the, trying to herd the kids around to, it's basically going to be like herding cats. Very difficult. And I was wondering if you took into consideration the German study when you were making this decision. And also, I can give you I don't know.
Thank you.
This is a quick excerpt. That's a quick excerpt about mask wearing. It's put out by a journal that's published by the CDC. And the reference is non-pharmaceutical measures for pandemic influenza in non-healthcare settings, personal protective and environmental measures. And and I'm quoting the abstract here. Here we review the evidence based on effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical personal protective measures and environmental hygiene measures in non-healthcare settings and discuss their potential inclusion in pandemic plans. Although mechanistic studies support potential effect of hygiene in face masks, evidence from 14 randomized controlled trials of these measures did not support a substantial effect on transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. We similarly found limited events on the effectiveness of improved hygiene and environmental cleaning. Here are quotes from pages 970 and 972 of the review. In our systematic review, we identified 10 randomized controlled trials that reported estimates of the effectiveness of face masks in reducing laboratory-confirmed influenza virus infections in the community from literature published during 1946 to July 27, 2018. In pooled analysis, we found no significant reduction in influenza transmission with the use of face masks. It goes on to say, disposable medical masks, also known as surgical masks, are loose-fitting devices that were designed to be worn by medical personnel who to protect accidental contamination of a patient's wounds. and to protect the wearer against splashes or sprays of bodily fluids. There is limited evidence of their effectiveness in preventing influenza virus transmission, either when worn by the infected person for source control or when worn by uninfected persons to reduce exposure. Our systematic review found no significant effect of face masks on transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. Now, I'm sure that the influenza that they were testing was a lot larger than COVID-19. COVID-19 is supposed to be even more microscopic than the standard influenza, which in my mind would mean that the face masks are even less effective. So trying to mandate the wearing of face masks in schools with kids, it doesn't seem like it's worth the effort unless I see some scientific evidence. I mean, this is right from the CDC. So, and I hear a lot of anecdotal stuff out there saying that just wear the mask because if it protects you 10%, it's 10% more. But, it isn't really 10% more. It's really not anything. So I'm wondering if you took the study into consideration regarding the German study saying kids don't transmit it, in the second study that says the masks are ineffective. And can you provide the data, the science, the references that say that masks are effective? I know that Dr. Tony Fauci recently flip-flopped, where back in March he said it wasn't effective at all, and then recently, in my opinion, when it became political, he started supporting the use of the masks.
In terms of the exact study you're referencing, I'm not sure. I've read an awful lot of documents. I also participated with colleagues from all over Germany and England that have already reopened via Zoom, and they went through the step-by-step process, how they were successful. And there is this debate around masks, and at the present time, I'm making the recommendation to use masks. If I see data or further studies come out that invalidates masks, then we wouldn't use masks. But right now...
This study here is from May 20th, 2020.
Right. And again, I may have looked at it, yeah, and I'm happy to look at it. I have no problem looking at it. I'm just saying as of tonight, these are the procedures I'm suggesting and recommending. And again, this is what I'm comfortable doing for your children because it's what I would do for my child. So we might disagree, but this is what I would do for my child, so that's the recommendation I'm going to make.
Right, okay, so maybe you can you come up with the studies that you're looking at and somewhere publish them?
I'd be happy to provide you what I've looked at, and at the same time, I will more than happily read your study, because I'm not saying I've seen everything. I just tell you there's enough paper that's come across the desk that I couldn't tell you what I've read and what I haven't read.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pam Hicks, 8 Maple Knoll Drive. I just had a couple of questions on, for when the kids come back, for the face masks. And I know there's a huge debate, and I happen to believe that there is some, usefulness to them. But for the kids, they do not take this seriously. And it's, a huge sticking point, I know, for a lot of parents. But when their kids get together, there are no masks. There is zero social distancing. So I didn't know, has any consideration been given to when the kids are moving around wearing masks in the hallways, and then when they get to the classroom situated, and then the masks come off because they can maintain those social distancing? Because these are tough. We're all sending them in the now, and a lot of our classrooms are not air conditioned, and that was my other question: is what is being done to look at keeping the air flowing in these classrooms? I know the HVA systems are key with these filtration systems in not spreading this. So if we do have a contamination, a case, that will be key in keeping that down. Because I did find, as you all know, that there were ICUs where it was transmitted to other places in the hospital where people picked up COVID through the HVAC systems. So it was just those questions on keeping the air moving and what is being done to look at that.
Sure. To your first point, we will build in mask breaks. It may differ from room to room because some teachers may have a compromised system and would be more comfortable with the children keeping the mask on, but maybe when the art teacher comes in, there's a different set of circumstances. The second point, we've hired an independent person who is looking at the HVAC, and that's the number one thing that he has said is it is about airflow. So we will be turning our air over, is my intent, much quicker than we traditionally do, which will probably cause an increase to my heating bill, but at the same time, it's the right thing to do from all the research we've seen so far.
Right. But what about those classrooms that don't have, because almost none have air conditioning, and so that, is that air stagnant at this point?
No, the air isn't stagnant. And then one of the pieces, the voters were kind enough to pass the H-Smart project, which is lighting, heating, and that. So we're in the midst of getting new, what I'll call unit ventilators for our classrooms, as well as a new air handler, thank you, which actually is on the roof and does all of these large spaces. We are expecting that to be delivered and in place, and it was just because we were already doing the project, but we've talked about the experts about, you know, the filters on those and what other steps we can take. So I will be receiving a report sometime in early August from him on all 6 buildings, and we'll be putting that information out to the community.
Okay. You might want to reach out to Art Lightford, you know, the dentist in town. He's got some units that he has put in for disinfecting and whatnot that really look very interesting, that you might want to.
I saw them today.
I did too.
Yeah. And
they look pretty great.
we have looked at some of those pieces, and it just, where we are a kids-only environment pretty much, it's not the same as what I'll say a commercial building. So we'll take what steps we can, but some of the pieces that you might see in a hospital or a different type of environment aren't necessarily well received by students.
So as a follow-up to that, as part of our H-STEP program, we had installed many different air source heat pumps that service classrooms. They're not necessarily connected together, so they're servicing specific classrooms, almost on a classroom basis. I think 1 or 2 examples we were sharing, but it's not a system that's servicing the entire school. So you have a level of granularity and point of use, if you will, with these air source heat pumps. So I'm not an expert in there, but I would be interested in knowing how that benefits the whole HVAC picture versus maybe, hey, that's, you know, it's not helping, but I'd be interested if it is.
Rob, may I
Because I know
interrupt
it's having
just a moment to the point? I serve as the representative on the facilities projects and have since their inception, and this topic is, you know, topic number 1, aside from the obvious hardware and construction and scheduling concerns. We're all discussing what the individual units in all the different rooms in both buildings, because they're, over the years with the buildings having been cobbled together at different times, there are different kinds of units. And then how they run, how they're filtered, how can we optimize their utility for addressing this contagion issue. So these things are being discussed not only by the facilities committee under the administration's study for these purposes that you're seeing on the screen, but also within what we're calling H-Smart, this secondary phase of replacing. So like in here, you see these massive blue. This is the air handler number 3. It's huge, it's monumental, and it will be brand new as soon as we can get our hands on it and get it installed. And how we run that and what it can and can't do is very much job number 1.
And I know these are very expensive things, but
well, they're already in
Yeah.
place or being purchased for the project. We're just very fortunate that these last few years, we've been right in the middle of this equipment turnover, and we're, I'm just saying from 2 different standpoints, from the COVID planning and separately from this construction and implementation planning. Both sides are looking very actively at how can we maximize the health and safety functions of these units, some of which cover a large section of building at once, and some of which are room by room, and we're trying to optimize.
Right. Because I know the end game of all of this is to get the kids in the classroom with the social distancing. I have a daughter with asthma, and so for me, having her in the best environment without a mask on is a great angle for that. But thank you.
Sure.
My name is Maria. I just wanted to provide a little bit more of the science behind.
Just for the record, could you speak a little clearly into the mic, just so for the record, the recorder, our
Okay.
secretary can make sure
Sure.
she's recording it right. And your address, please.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
All right. I just wanted to provide a little bit more of the science of wearing masks in a social setting. And there is, there are currently studies that show that not only do they not work, but I'm not so concerned about whether they work or not. I'm more concerned about the health effects of wearing a mask. And I just wanted to point out that there is science that says there are potential health risks of wearing a mask, and that includes something called viral load. Okay, so as you know, most children and healthy adults are asymptomatic, right? So if you're asymptomatic and you're wearing a mask and you happen to have small droplets of the virus in your trachea or in your lungs, what happens is breathing in your own humid air, especially with cloth masks, will cause the virus to multiply and make you sick, okay? So that's what I'm concerned about. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the science. This is from the British Medical Journal. Face masks make breathing more difficult. Well, I'll skip over that. It says, a fraction of carbon dioxide previously exhaled is inhaled at each respiratory cycle. Those two phenomena increase breathing frequency and deepness, and hence they increase the amount of inhaled and exhaled air. This may worsen the burden of COVID-19 if infected people wearing masks spread more contaminated air. This may also worsen the clinical condition of infected people if the enhanced breathing pushes the viral load down into their lungs. And then it goes, and then there's another section here that says, the innate immunity efficacy is highly dependent on the viral load. If face masks determine a humid habitat for SARS-CoV-2, where the SARS-CoV-2 virus can remain active due to the water vapor continuously provided by breathing and capturing the mask fabric, they determine an increase in viral load, and therefore they can cause a defeat of the innate immunity and an increase in infection. More science is, okay, so we all know that the New England Journal of Medicine, the World Health Organization, the CDC all previously gave reasons why no one should wear a mask if they're not taking care of a COVID patient. I'm not sure why those things changed. There's been no science, no blind, double-blind studies, no peer-reviewed studies showing that they work. There are plenty of studies saying they're dangerous, and I'm concerned that my child has to wear a mask in school, to be honest with you. A lot of people assume that we're, if we don't want to wear a mask, we're combative. But no, I follow the science, and the science says, don't wear a mask. You need to be breathing fresh air, especially when the children are asymptomatic most of the time. I believe that we're going to be making them sick. Here's a doctor from Dr. David Lang, MD. Walking around with an ill-fitted cloth mask is merely a reservoir for moisture and other disease-causing bacteria. It most certainly will not stop any virus, which is like a mosquito through a chain-link fence. That's the size of the virus, okay? Plus, every time you touch the mask in your face with your unwashed hands, you are merely seeding your mask with any bacteria you picked up. It is basically a giant petri dish you have strapped to your face, okay? So now we have students who have no clinical experience in the medical setting. We're expecting them to be doctors and know what to do. No, they're going to be touching, okay? So I don't believe that it's safe to send our kids to school with masks. I believe actually most kids are asymptomatic. Most healthy people and adults are asymptomatic. The data proves it. I've been watching the data since March, and I really don't understand what the situation is here. The flu virus kills people more indiscriminately, and more children and healthy adults have died from the flu, so I'm not really sure why we're putting these measures in place. I'll go on to say a few more things. Well, this one deals with the reduced levels of O2 in your blood. I'll just go down the bullet list. So, decreases oxygen intake. Breathing through a mask decreases the amount of oxygen we need to live and be healthy, increases blood acidity, and makes breathing difficult. Number 2, increases toxin inhalation. Toxins that we normally exhale as we breathe become trapped in the mask